y'all, welcome back to Module 3. This is going to discuss the changing landscape of sport. We'll be pulling from GEMS chapters 5 and 6, as well as Wiggins chapters 6 and 8. The first half of this lecture is going to consider sport in the Gilded Age. We'll be talking about sport roughly from 1870 through about 1880. As we'll talk about in just a little bit, one of the key characteristics of the Gilded Age was this transition to a consumption economy. This resulted in social stratification, and ultimately sport became a way to both separate and unite Americans. How did it do so? We separated and united groups based upon their skill, wealth, gender, and power. Sport served as a way that like skill groups could show their prowess. It also became a way where wealthy groups distinguished themselves from others, as well as men differing from women, and groups of power differing themselves from groups with less power. There were a number of key characteristics that defined the Gilded Age. First of all, as we talked prior about this push towards a consumption economy, it makes sense then that the independent farmer gave way to a capitalist entrepreneur. Also, one of the practiced theories throughout this time was social Darwinism, or survival of the fittest. As we moved towards a capitalistic society, large corporations dominated the economy. It should be noted, though, that within these large corporations, bribery and corruption was rampant. This will become key as we move forward. The characteristics of the Gilded Age also had an impact on sport. At the end of Module 2, in that lecture, we talked a little bit about the Civil War and the impact that that had on sport. In the Gilded Age, we are in a post-Civil War era, and therefore it makes sense that we still saw this increased emphasis on fitness as it pertained to military drills. Physical fitness and military drills were instilled in educational settings. We also saw this at an increase in urban gyms, and things even such as weight training were infused into urban gyms in order to prepare people for this kind of military drilling. It's also important to note that, as keeping with the characteristics of the Gilded Age, American sport sought to distinguish itself from British practices. It wanted to be different than British practices. Furthermore, in the Gilded Age, women's colleges encouraged physical activity. Specifically, we saw this at Vassar and Wellesley. Lastly, the regulation of sport emanated from urban processes as the U.S. experienced a social transformation. That social transformation largely was around the notion that America was trying to separate itself and be a push towards a nation. Religion in the Gilded Age also began to look different. Society turned towards secularization. Moral prohibitions were loosened, and even this idea of maintaining the Sabbath also became more loose or liberal. However, kind of on the other hand, though, in this contest for souls, YMCAs, YMHAs, and YWCAs ultimately experienced growth throughout this era as sport was utilized as a tool to gather souls. In addition, throughout the Gilded Age, Protestantism began to rise. This American religion encouraged individualism. That is, individualism was ultimately at odds with the communal culture of immigrants, so assimilation wasn't even. What does that mean? While Protestantism encouraged individualism, oftentimes immigrant groups sought community as a way to maintain their culture. Therefore, Protestantism and immigration was at odds with each other. Urbanization and some key technological advances impacted sport in various ways in the Gilded Age. First of all, electricity replaced gas lights. This allowed for longer play or participation of sport even into the dark hours. Sport clubs and entrepreneurs offered more commercialized entertainment. And lastly, sporting good manufacturers rose throughout this time. A couple of key manufacturers that we even know today, or these brands, were developed in the 1880s. Spalding and Rawlings were those two key ones. They were able to use mail order business or advertisements to draw in customers. In addition, they streamlined the production process in order that they could be more efficient with their sporting good manufacturing. Even though America was pushing towards nationalism, sport showed the way at which the nation was divided. And you can think about this division based upon two groups. There was sport that was for the elite. This involved things such as horse racing, yachting, and polo clubs. Even at horse racing tracks, there were specialized clubhouses that separated fans based upon status. The famous New York Athletic Club formed during this era, and yet it was just another place for elite to participate in leisure activities. On the other side of the spectrum, sport and leisure was divided across ethnic groups. As we've seen throughout our lectures, sport provided a way for varying ethnic groups to maintain their culture and ethnicity. This maintained throughout the Gilded Age. Various ethnic groups continued to partake in sports that were native to their homelands in order to maintain community throughout their ethnic groups. You can see on that right-hand slide, there's a variation across some ethnic groups. Pay particular attention to African Americans as we saw that they were banned from clubs and pro sport in the North, and therefore they ultimately started to form their own YMCA baseball teams and etc. As we talked in this prior slide, sport was divided in the Gilded Age by elite status and ethnic groups. In addition, sport was divided by concepts of masculinity and femininity. Throughout the Gilded Age, bachelor subcultures grew, and this group of people used sport to maintain a sense of toughness and physicality. Also, immigrant populations that were coming to the States were largely men, and sport offered the way to maintain a sense of community. Concepts of femininity were also considered throughout the Gilded Age. Pastimes for working class women looked different than those for white, middle, and upper class women. That is, pastimes for working class women often were derived around being pedestrians and boxing. On the other hand, for middle and upper class women, there were these socially acceptable forms of exercise: tennis, physical activity at women's colleges, and so on. It should be noted, though, that in order to maintain concepts of femininity, women were supposed to wear these traditional forms of clothing, which included corsets and other restrictive pieces. This still made it difficult to be involved in physical activity. Also, throughout the Gilded Age, this notion of women's rights and women's rights efforts are on the rise. Therefore, divorce rights and suffrage were also occurring throughout this time. Mrozek in Wiggins Chapter 6 provides a detailed and specific example of how sport was divided based upon wealth and power. This author even goes into detail to distinguishing between groups for the rich and the ultra-rich. Wealthy Americans used sport to establish themselves as prestigious and socially exclusive from others. The rich and ultra-powerful favored sport they ultimately had control over. And again, Mrozek gives this interesting example and detail of how this played out in the Gilded Age. As I talked about earlier, in this post-Civil War era, physical activity and sport was strongly tied to educational settings. Therefore, it makes sense then that intercollegiate sport continued to rise throughout this time. Rowing maintained its popularity, but we also saw an increase in popularity in track, baseball, and football. A couple of things that should be noted about football, and we'll talk about this in the coming lecture, that football was increasingly violent, and it ultimately served as a way to maintain masculinity. For many, football still served as a way to represent war and this idea of battling for territory. And it prepared individuals for this idea of war. Again, we'll spend quite a bit of time going forward talking about football and the impact it did have. I talked early on about this era being a push for economics, and as is representative of this era, sport entrepreneurs had a strong impact on the games and sports we played. First of all, this is an interesting point. One of the ways that sport began to change and the sporting landscape was changed was by Chadwick. This individual developed the box score, batting average, and the quantification of sporting stats. We use many of those today. In addition to help with mobility, Pope manufactured and promoted bicycles. Not only did this allow people to be mobile, but it ultimately would become a place of sport. And we talked about prior sporting goods manufacturers. Spalding is key in the products he manufactured, and also his connection to using sponsorships and or athletes connected to his sporting good products. These will all be important going forward, as this sets the groundwork for some of the major things and innovations we see in sport. The remaining portion of this lecture is going to move on to talk about sport in the progressive era. It's a shorter time frame. It's roughly 1890 to 1900. While the Gilded Age was known for many advances, it also was known for its excesses or sin. A number of things included, and we talked about some of these prior: corrupt government, unbridled wealth, exploitation of the masses, and unequal rights. As we talked prior in several areas, this notion of groups tried to distinguish themselves based upon their social status. Sport was one of the ways we did that. It should be noted then that the progressive era, which followed the Gilded Age, is marked by social reform. Social reformers wanted to right these wrongs. A couple of things emerged out of this push to right these wrongs. First of all, muckraking journalists were common as they sought to expose the corruption. In addition, social work began as a new profession to promote social justice. Going forward, we will see several social justices that occur, and it's ultimately a result of the social reform pushed in the progressive era. A key emphasis for social reformers in the progressive era was the notion of children. Because of the large influx of immigrant population, there was a large number of immigrant children and, as stated in the text, wandering children. Therefore, there was a push for assimilation. Physical activity became one of those areas that social reformers thought would help assimilate these immigrant children groups throughout the progressive era. In addition, this three-step process for assimilation included the following: creation of child labor laws, ultimately then also a mandatory education for children, and in that mandatory education, mandatory physical education was called for. Social reformers in the progressive era sought to assimilate immigrant children into American values, and one of the ways they did this was through physical education. Sport was deemed integral at this time to moral education. However, there were competing philosophies on how one might best educate these kids. It should be noted, though, that as all around, sport was deemed a way to shape and teach America's youth. Finally, comprehensive athletic programs were introduced into some public schools. And because, throughout this assimilation progress, education was now mandatory, it became key that athletics were also part of this educational process. It was mentioned prior that throughout the Gilded Age, football was on the rise. It finds more popularity throughout the progressive era. Between 1865 and 1898, the country experienced a time of peace, or no war, and football ultimately became a place where young men could prove masculinity. Throughout this time, nearly 100 colleges began to field teams, and we began to see early signs of football as spectacle and even football as corruption. Even in some of its earliest states, football was shrouded in controversy. First of all, that controversy surrounded violence. The game of football did not require helmets until 1939. It also was known for a number of brutal tactics and mass plays. This resulted in a number of deaths and serious injuries. By 1909, the death toll for those participating in football had risen to 33. Because of this, the violent nature of the game and the injury it was causing to its participants, the NCAA organized by college officials from 68 institutions in response to this violence. They began to institute new rules, such as a forward pass, in hopes that they would reduce the violence and ultimately the number of injuries and deaths in football. It is in the progressive era that the father of American football emerges, Walter Camp. Oriard in Wiggins chapter 8 does a fantastic job of detailing the importance of Camp's role in the rise of American football. He not only revolutionized the game in terms of how it was played and how it was practiced, he also pushed for a number of key rule changes that ultimately continued to shape how the game was played. Camp was also famous for his publications regarding the All-American team. On this slide, I've included a website of Walter Camp's website today. It gives a good depiction of his history, as well as some of the things that still go on in honor of his name. Because of the large growth of cities throughout the Progressive Era and the influx of immigrant population to these cities, parks or open spaces were important throughout the Progressive Era to help ease this congestion. In addition, and in keeping in line with the assimilation of children, playgrounds were built to offer spaces for children. Not only were reformers interested in assimilating children throughout the Progressive Era, they also had strong interest in assimilating immigrant populations. Therefore, settlement houses were instituted and used as a way to assist in assimilating immigrants and providing a space for community interaction. There were a couple key technological advances throughout the Progressive Era that are worthy of mentioning. First of all, Dunlap produced the pneumatic tire. This ultimately changed cycling and harness racing. In addition, there were a number of media advancements that maintained the ability to produce mainstream magazines, and these mainstream magazines often covered sport. Finally, there was the development of the combustible engine. This led to auto racing and motorcycle racing. Last but not least of the Progressive Era, we need to talk about the modern Olympics. It is in this time that Pierre de Coubertin of France saw the emphasis of education and sport in Britain and the US, and he ultimately wanted to emulate that. He did so by developing the Olympic Games. As we know, historically, the first Olympic Games took place in Athens in 1896. Should be noted, women were not allowed to participate. The Olympic Games would officially come to the US in 1904 in St. Louis. Going forward in a couple of our other lectures, upcoming lectures I should say, we will talk about the Olympics at length. As we've seen in prior lectures, the last slide leaves you with some questions for thought. Use it as the way to fact check yourself and point out key areas of application.